Major breaking news, and this is something you likely missed, but this is fantastic news for our right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment, and America generally. And that is a huge antitrust case is now allowed to move forward against BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street Corporation down there in federal court in Texas, dealing with ESG and DEI issues. This is a huge deal, and it may very well save America's gun industry. Let's talk about it when we come back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Dine, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice in the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, this is a fantastic bit of good news. This may be the biggest and the best news for the conservative movement, for the gun movement, for the Second Amendment movement, for Donald Trump in the last 10 days. And it likely was missed by you because it's super geeky in certain respects, and it deals with, believe it or not, antitrust law and proxy voting of shares. And before you tune off this channel, because of this, you don't want to miss this. Trust me. Okay. So let me explain what's going on here. There are three huge companies that are totally woke in my view. They're big into woke and they're big into left-wing elitism, all the terrible things in my view. And my guess in your view, these companies basically subscribe to politically, and that is the three companies of BlackRock, State Street Corporation, and Vanguard Group. Now, why should we be talking about these huge Wall Street companies, these investment houses, in the context of the Second Amendment? Because of what just occurred, and that is this. A federal district court judge down in the Eastern District of Texas has just found that a lawsuit brought by something like over a dozen red state attorney generals, including the state of Texas, have just pled a claim for antitrust violations by these individual companies. Why? Because they were improperly, according to the allegations, using their proxy votes to vote the shares of not only their own, but also other people in a way that was not conducive to the shareholders' interest. And specifically, they are to have alleged to have used all of this power in owning these coal-related companies to try to basically destroy the coal industry, at the same time drive up the price of coal, and rather than expanding the supply of coal, they tried to shrink the supply of coal by virtue of how they behaved in unison with one another, essentially in collusion with one another to destroy the American coal industry, all in a very anti-competitive way. And as a result of this, the lawsuit seeking damages for antitrust violations is allowed to move forward. But the reality of what just occurred here is that this 61-page opinion by a very reputable federal judge in Texas has just provided a judicial roadmap for suing American companies that prioritize ESG or DEI and other left-wing liberal policies over simply staying in their lane and doing what's best financially. Let's break this down a little bit more because it's a little confusing, but this is a huge deal, folks. This is a big deal, and it may very well be such a big deal, it will save the American gun industry from the sort of predation that the American coal industry has been experiencing, because what these companies were doing to coal over the last 10 years is the sort of thing they 100%, in my view, would turn around and do to the American gun industry. And what exactly is that? So, to begin with, the way this works, folks, is over the last 10 to 20 years on Wall Street, and many of you have this in your IRAs, in your 401ks, in your pension plans, just privately, and that is you own what are known as index funds. Index funds. These are things like QQQ, they may be SPY, they may be a particular sector, but what these are, these index funds are basically run by companies like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and they allow you as an investor, either through your retirement funds or privately, to invest in like an entire sector Or like, for example, the SPYs allow you to invest in, like, I think all of the S&P 500. QQQ allows you to invest like in sort of the high tech space and so on without getting into the details. The point is these index funds have become extremely popular in all areas of Wall Street, including, for example, Bitcoin. You can now invest in ETFs and other things associated with Bitcoins. Now, the reason why this is important is that what's been going on, you got to understand what's been going on, and then you'll see the problem, and then I'll explain that it's now being fixed. What's been going on is this. When you, as an investor, and there's billions, if not trillions of dollars of money in these index funds now, and these three companies are by far and away the largest creators and investors and generators of these index funds. What happens is you buy an index fund. So from your point of view, you're going to get the economic benefit if the index fund goes up, and the economic downside if the index fund goes down. Now, here's the thing. Those index funds are really a basket of investments. A basket of investments. They're a basket of stocks or whatever it might be. So, for example, if you invest, let's say, in an index fund of coal companies or energy companies, in that index fund, whoever runs it, could be BlackRock, State Street, could be Vanguard, whomever runs the index fund is responsible for taking your money, put it into the index fund, and they in turn take your money. Listen carefully, this is important. They in turn take your money and on behalf of the index fund go out into the stock market and they buy individual stocks that make up that index fund. So if you invest in an index fund, let's say, of coal-fired plants or coal companies, let's say, okay? And let's say there's 20 coal companies in that index of coal companies. You're going to buy the index, and you're going to own the index. But what happens is the sponsor of the index, often BlackRock, State Street, or Vanguard, the three defendants in this case that we're talking about, they would go out into the marketplace and they would buy the shares in those individual companies as part of the index. So here's the key. When you own a share of a corporation, a share of a company, outright, let's say you buy 100 shares of Microsoft or 100 shares of Nvidia or 100 shares of Amazon for the sake of argument, okay? You have all the rights associated with that stock, which includes not just the right to benefit from if the stock goes up in value, the stock goes down in value, you can, pledge the stock as collateral if you need to borrow money against the stock. You can do all this stuff like any other piece of property. But there's a critical thing, and listen carefully, folks. This is the mission critical point that you got to understand. One part of owning that stock in that company, Microsoft, Nvidia, okay, IBM, doesn't matter, is that you have the right as the owner of that stock, that individual stock in that individual company, to go out and vote by proxy for shareholder resolutions or for who the manager should be or for who the shareholders will be. You see what I'm saying? Part of your ownership right as an owner in an individual stock in an individual company is you have the right to vote for management. You have the right to vote who is going to be on the board of directors. Now, here's the sleight of hand, and this is the key thing to understand. In contrast, when you go out and buy an index fund that's made up of a bunch of companies, guess what? You do have the economic benefit if that index goes up and the economic downfall if it goes down in value and price, okay? But my question is, who votes the shares, the proxy? Who votes the shares for management, for shareholder resolution, for who's on the board? Who votes on behalf of the shares of those companies that go into that basket of shares that make up the index fund that you own? Who gets to vote those individual shares in those individual companies that are part of the basket of companies making up the index fund that you own the index for? The answer is historically, these companies, the sponsors of the index funds, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Vanguards of the world, they get to vote who gets to be in management, who's on the board, how to vote the shareholder resolutions. Do you see what I'm saying? So you get the economic benefits of the index, but they get to vote the individual shares that make up those index funds. And you're like, Mark, why do I care about this? Why am I listening to this video? Why does this matter for the Second Amendment? It's a big deal. Why is that? Because as this complaint alleges and lays out in great detail, I should say this opinion based on the complaint by this judge, he points out that these companies, these three companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, bought up like 25% of the coal companies in America. And they did a lot of that by virtue of these index funds. So people were buying and investing in coal companies through these various forms of index funds in one form or another. And these particular three companies were voting the shares of these coal companies that are in these index funds. And they were doing it by what's known as proxy. They were voting as proxies of the actual owners of these shares. But here's what happened that caused them to allegedly run afoul of antitrust law and federal law. So much so that even the Trump administration, the FTC on behalf of Donald Trump, came in here and agreed with the state of Texas and all these other attorney generals and said, yeah, these defendants are not following the law. They are violating various forms of antitrust law because they're colluding to try to destroy America's coal industry in the name of these left-wing policies like ESG and DEI and the like. And they're voting those shares that they don't actually own. They own by virtue of the proxy, right? The owners of these shares are technically the people that bought into the index funds, but these three companies were voting by proxy those shares in the index funds, and as effect of them, they had like 25% of the proxy votes of the coal industry in the United States of America, which is very powerful. And that meant that if they decide to vote all their shares for a left-wing member of the board, well, guess what? Or if they said to the company, we want you to do ESG, we want you to do all this left-wing propaganda, we want you to worry about climate change. Guess what? They had the power of the vote and the shareholder vote to force these companies to embrace these left-wing policy objectives. And this lawsuit says that's illegal. And this judge just said, based upon the allegations, much of which are based on what happened publicly, these statements by these companies about how they want to advance the destruction of coal in America for so-called clean energy, to advance this left-wing agenda, the judge down there in Texas said, yeah, this appears to be based on the allegations to violate federal law and is a no-go zone. And these companies can be held hugely liable for billions, potentially, and billions of dollars, depending on what happens with damages. So this is crazy good for us, because this precedent that has just been set in the context of these companies advancing the left-wing environmental agenda of quote-unquote climate change brought about by man, supposedly, and humans, they were just slapped down and told what you did by colluding to hurt the price, or basically to shrink the supply of coal in America, even while coal prices were going up. This allegedly, and may very well on its face, violate federal law. And this lawsuit can move forward. And the reason why this is such a huge deal for the Second Amendment, folks, is nothing at all would prevent, up until now at least, these same three companies from embracing left-wing anti-gun agenda items and buying up a huge percentage of the publicly traded gun companies out there and other American companies, and forcing those companies by virtue of how they vote the shares found within these index funds to advance some sort of a left-wing agenda, which means they could have forced publicly traded defense companies and publicly traded gun companies and the like to advance and agree with who knows what kind of left-wing nuttiness is out there. But now that is not going to be possible. This is now nipped in the bud and will be shut down, in my opinion, by virtue of this huge decision against BlackRock, against State Street, and against Vanguard. And I'll put a link to the opinion down below. It's 61 pages, and you can check it out. It makes a lot more sense when you read it. You'll see exactly what they were alleged to have done. And basically, this is destruction of the perniciousness of wokeness at the corporate level, using these proxies of shares that they didn't really own because they were technically owned by the index that you invested in, but you got the economic benefit, but they got to vote the shares. And by doing that, they got to exert huge power over the management decisions of these various coal companies and force them to embrace the green agenda, even though I suspect none of the coal companies really wanted to, but they didn't have a choice because of the voting power that these companies had by virtue of the shareholders' shareholder shares that they were able to vote by virtue of proxy, thanks to their ownership and control over these index funds and more. So here's what the court had to say, leading off in this big victory for freedom against these companies. Federal antitrust law is a central safeguard for the nation's free market structures. Antitrust laws are as important to the preservation of economic freedom and our free enterprise system as the Bill of Rights is to the protection of our fundamental personal freedoms. Thus, antitrust law does not yield to the prevailing social policy of the day. This case brings these principles into focus. Plaintiffs allege that defendants BlackRock, State Street Corporation, and Vanguard Group acquired substantial stock holdings in every significant publicly held coal producer in the United States and agreed to use their holdings to influence these companies and artificially depress the output of coal. Defendants allegedly did so in the name of environmental stewardship and concern for the climate. The result, the plaintiffs assert, is that defendants have reaped the rewards of higher returns, higher fees, and higher profits, while American consumers have paid the price in higher utility bills and higher costs. Plaintiffs allege these violations of both state and federal antitrust laws. So that sums it up quite nicely, but the way they did it, these companies alleged to have done it, was through this perniciousness of this left-wing environmental policies, this greenhouse gas stuff, and all this sort of, what do you want to call it, green energy stuff, climate change stuff, all basically to destroy the American coal industry, as best I can tell. Again, here's what this opinion by this judge had to say about what was going on with these three companies and the way they voted their shares to control America's coal companies. Defendants allegedly joined certain climate initiatives in which they publicly committed to use their stock to take necessary action on climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These commitments allegedly included striving for all assets under management to achieve net zero emissions, meaning coal production declines toward zero, and immediately ceasing all financial or other support to coal companies expanding production. Defendants allegedly affirmed these commitments through public statements such as BlackRock's asking companies to set short-term, medium, and long-term targets for greenhouse gas reductions, Vanguard's asking companies with significant coal exposure how they set targets in alignment with the Paris Agreement and the Glasgow Climate Pact, and State Street's creating ESG scores for companies and telling them their score will soon effectively be as important as their credit rating. Defendants then allegedly followed through on those commitments by voting against directors at the coal companies. Defendants allegedly did use their stock through proxy voting or otherwise to bring about or attempt to bring about substantial lessening of competition. So in essence, these companies, by virtue of voting by proxy, the shares they had in these index funds exercised this huge control over these coal companies to reduce the supply and actually threaten the existence of coal in America, which gave rise to higher prices and more money for them, among other things. But the point is, it is clear this is a roadmap for anyone that wants to sue these kinds of companies for advancing the left-wing agenda, ESG, DEI, whatever you want to call it, instead of staying in their lane and doing what they need to be doing, which is just focusing on making money and not trying to get all political, using the ability to vote and control management over America's publicly traded companies by virtue of the fact these companies have control of the proxy votes of the shares of all the companies that go into the index funds that many of us own quite a bit of. And they basically, while we get the economic benefit of it, they get to vote the shares that we have in those index funds, and they were exercising liberal control over America's coal companies. And that looks to be coming to an end based on this decision. But again, we'll see what happens, and I'll keep you informed. But this is a very big deal, because if they could do this to exert this kind of control over coal companies and other companies in the United States, they certainly could do the same sort of thing with publicly traded gun and defense-oriented companies. And we would not want that to occur. To have these, these big-time left-wing companies controlling America's gun companies. That would not be good for our Second Amendment rights. All right, folks, hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is a big win for American freedom, all up and down the board. I'm happy to report. Make sure you follow me on X, of course, if you like this video, at 4 Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble, and I look forward to talking to you again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.